Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this public roundtable session that we're going to have here today. We're just going to wait another second or two for some of the participants to roll in. Today, we're going to be talking about trust in the age of AI imagery. And what we have is a roundtable discussion with some of the leaders in the DMO space. So we'll do one more beat here and then we'll get started. All right, let's roll. I am your host for today. I am C.A. Clark. I'm the Vice President of AI at Miles Partnership. And also one of the things that I do in that capacity is a program that is called AI Opener for Destinations. AI Opener is an exploration of the intersection of AI and tourism. We've been running this in North America since January of 2024. So we have about 40 destinations, organizations, not just destinations, also open to other travel and tourism entities. So we have about 40 organizations that participate in 2026, and we explore different topics as part of that program. Throughout the year. One of those is definitely, we talk a lot about imagery and kind of the development of imagery and what that means for the travel industry. And that's what our roundtable is about today. So I wanted to pull a couple of highlights of things that have happened just in the last few months, because there's been quite a lot of it. So first off, we have ChatGPT Images 2.0 was quite a big jump in terms of the capability. Already, ChatGPT images were quite good, particularly when we talked about editing. Text rendering tended to sometimes not be super high fidelity, and the Images 2.0 definitely changes that. So quite a lot of capability there. If you haven't played around with ChatGPT Images 2.0, it's quite good. Here's just an example to kind of give you the scale of things. So this is Miami Beach. There's a prompt that says, give me a picture of Miami Beach that's shot from the ground and has a bunch of details in it. And you can see this is the previous version of ChatGPT's images, and it just sort of copy pastes the buildings all the way down. You can see it's kind of that style, right? But it doesn't really look like a picture of Miami Beach. And then this one is the current version of ChatGPT's images, which is much better at the structural. And this is partially why I do this kind of test, is looking at the structural. How does it put this together? How does it understand what that place looks like? And so you can see that this really has a lot of the hallmarks of Ocean Drive there, with the bike path and the parking and the buildings, and they look quite a bit more accurate than they did before. So we're seeing some really huge jumps in the ability for these models to demonstrate understanding of place. This is Google's Nano Banana, and so two different versions of that, the older one and then the latest one that also has that bike path. You can see they're definitely progressing towards that much higher level of physical accuracy. And that's even becoming more of a big deal as we kind of move. I have a couple slides at the end of this. So CDance, the ByteDance, the company behind TikTok and CapCut, earlier in the year had released a video model that has really high character fidelity. So that's that alone was quite a big change for like how video works. And then, not to be outdone, Google just recently, so a week ago or 2 weeks ago at I/O, announced a number of different models. One of them is called Gemini Omni, which is starting out with video. So their whole pitch is you can create anything from any input. And then starting with video, Omni is kind of I suppose, a response to CDance in a way, in that it has really high character fidelity. It is essentially Nano Banana for video. So before, you could take an image and you could modify that image in more or less any way. That was kind of the whole pitch, and we'd keep the same character, same person who is, subject, or however you wanted to do that. Now you can do that with video. And this is just an example. This came from an Ethan Mollick post where he tried to do a number of different things. This is like a classic, right? Like a film example. And so then it just sort of iterates over this, right? Changes all of the way that what the train looks like. And if you look very closely at this, you can check out the post on LinkedIn. If you look at the reflections, right, you can see like there's a lot of work that is going on there. So it's becoming really, really difficult to tell the difference between reality and something that is completely made up by AI. And then now, to make things even more complicated, Google's Genie, which is their world model, you can use Street View as a source or as grounding material for Genie. So if you don't know what Genie is, it's basically a persistent kind of generated world from text or an image. So you can kind of walk around, you can say a prompt, and then you can walk around inside there. And so now you can start with an actual place. You can choose a place in Street View, and then you can have Genie generate something. In this particular one, it had generated the Golden Gate Bridge underwater, but you can also do it as if it's in a real place. And they're releasing that as a as a private sort of beta right now. The ability to ground that generative AI stuff in Street View, which is the next slide there, Andy. If you can go ahead, there you go. So, so this one is private availability right now, but basically is saying you can use Street View data, which is about as accurate as it gets for a place, to create generative video visuals, right? Whether that's video or photos. And so there's this sort of convergence, right? Of we have the ability to create images that are not real in a place that looks like it is really real, right? And we have a lot of things. That's why we're having this roundtable today, is to talk about what that means for the travel industry, and particularly for destinations whose job it is to represent those destinations. Now, one thing that we've talked about before and have written blogs about is how do we tell which images are fake? And so there's a couple of different things that are happening there. And one of the most recent ones was C2PA, which is kind of a manifest for photos that says how they were made. Got picked up by OpenAI, in addition to some of the other platforms that create images. And so we're starting to see a little bit of this across the industry, where you would be able to see where an image came from and you'd be able to kind of track that. But you have to go do that, right? You have to go do that on purpose and go look at where that image came from, which, as we know, is probably not something that people are going to spend a lot of time on as they're experiencing these photos. Anyway, all of that to say, we wrote a white paper about this sort of topic and the kind of changes that are happening in the space, in the travel space and in images, and that is kind of the impetus for our roundtable today. So I would like to move on and welcome our guest speakers for today. So these are our three panelists, and we're going to ask a series of questions. We will take your questions. So if you have questions you want to put in the Q&A, then we'll go through those towards the end, and we will answer those. Oh, sorry, see, we had a slide for that. All right, let's go back to the introductory slide there, so that I can properly welcome our three panelists today. So starting out with Janette Roush, the Senior VP of Innovation and the Chief AI Officer at Brand USA. Thank you so much for joining us today, Janette. We also have Mark Senffner from Travel Oregon, Brand Manager. Thank you very much for joining us, Mark. And coming to us live from some airport somewhere or other is Dylan Thuras, Head of Storytelling and Creative at Odyssey Studios. Really appreciate you joining us. Dylan, some of you may know Dylan from his former work at Atlas Obscura. Excellent. Thank you all for jumping in today and participating. Let me start off with a couple of different questions. So in the white paper, we talk a little bit about AI image and video tools and have made the biggest leaps in the past year or so. How, for each of you, how has the conversation around AI visuals shifted in your organization? Like, has there been a reaction to that? Is there sort of more people who are asking those questions inside the organization? Or is it still kind of out there on the fringe? Let's start with Janette.
Yeah, we have definitely, taken notice, obviously, of how good the image generation tools have gotten. I think what it's turned into is a lot of opportunity for more education internally, because it's easy to use AI and not know that you are using AI when it comes to images. So I think tools like the generative fill that is part of the Adobe suite. And so the way that works is if you have an image and you wish it just was a little longer on another side, you press a button and AI will create an extension of the image for you. But that's AI, like that's not a real image.
Yeah.
And, you know, which might feel obvious when you say it out loud, but if you don't think about that and you have a policy about, like our AI policy is just be transparent about your AI use. If you were to put that somewhere and not realize that that was AI generated, well, that becomes non-transparent, right? Similarly, if you use an AI tool to edit an image, it's just recreating the image using AI, which means it's no longer actually a photo. So for us, it's a right, like, so it's, but again, if you don't know that, if you're not working in AI and reading about it all the time, like, how would you know that? And so that's why, you know, education and things like this webinar is just so important, because it's not like one is moral and the other is immoral. It's just, you need to understand how AI works in order to understand what you're dealing with. So we have like those are conversations we've absolutely had more of in the past year.
And that line, as you pointed out, is really blurry. Mark, at Travel Oregon, has this been kind of an increasing conversation about what is going on with AI images?
Yeah, we've had conversations that align with which I just talked about. You know, we moved kind of from it being a curiosity and a toy earlier on, you know, a year or two ago, and having the generative fill conversation too internally. You know, using that generative fill in certain ways just to speed up production, where it would take, you know, a designer, a Photoshop editor, you know, 30 minutes to do exactly that, extend a canvas for type or something like that, or logos at the bottom of it, whatever you need for that particular placement, and then whittling that time down to, you know, 30 seconds a minute, you know, doing it thoughtfully. Again, extending, you know, canvas or something in a mundane way, recreating content that isn't necessarily meaningful. You know, pathway in the bottom of a image to move people up a little bit into the center of an image and put type at the bottom or logo at the bottom, things like that. We've had those conversations and really moved on to like what you touched on, the like the ethical purpose of it, or the ethical considerations and disclosure. We don't disclose right now, but we don't use it, and we'll get to that a little bit later. We don't use it in ways that are, you know, creating necessarily meaningful content, adding people or you know, boats in the background or whatever. We haven't really taken that on, so we don't do disclosure at this point. I imagine we would, especially anything public facing. And then we've also taken, you know, had conversations and taken education like this and sessions at our governor's conference, our annual tourism conference, and bringing that to industry and really having those conversations on an ongoing basis, bringing experts in the AI space to host sessions. And then, yeah, I think people are also starting to, and we see this across the news and media internally, and partners talking about, you know, the implications of AI, whether it's, you know, water or energy consumption and database construction. So that's a larger, like, lateral conversation that we're having.
Yeah, I think those are, you know, you talked a little bit about like generative fill. And the interesting thing, both of you mentioned that you know, there's an interesting thing about that. That's stuff that we were doing before. Technically, that's not dramatically, it's just way easier to do.
Exactly.
And to you know, to Janette's point, that is entirely AI generated stuff. It looks like it's, you know, a copy paste, but it's not. Dylan, what about you from a conversation? Do you feel like there has been an increase in the questions that people have been asking, or kind of the approach to imagery in the last year or so?
We're just being hooligans, right? Yes. And forgive me if I start dropping out, just let me know. Yeah, I think the place I'm seeing it show up a lot is in internal and like partner docs. So I think imagery is getting used quite frequently in, the process of making a presentation or working up storyboards or other things like that. And in those places, I think it can be used to very good effect, depending on how much time you're willing to wrangle with it. So that's a place where I'm seeing it show up.
Excellent. All right, let's work backwards. I'm just going to add an extra question here. So you've all talked about different ways that kind of things are being used or being experimented with. And you've kind of mentioned some of these tools, but I think it would be good to hear like what kinds of tools are we using for this? So I've heard Adobe's kind of suite in here. Are there other tools that people are using inside their organization or experimenting with? And we'll start with you, Dylan. So we'll work backwards. So we'll go Dylan, Mark, and then Janette.
So say the question again, CA.
Just everyone's talked a little bit about kind of what they are doing. I wanted to ask a question about the specific tools so that people could get kind of a sense of like what are we actually talking about when we're doing these things? Is it just ChatGPT? Is it other kinds of tools?
Yeah. I've been playing with the new GPT image generation. I think that's been really, like you, I've been impressed with that. Nano Banana. I think, here's a funny way to talk about AI and imagery. I've also been using AI search functionality, which is very good. This is mostly in Claude. When I'm like, hey, I want to find a local photographer who makes images that look like this. Find me someone who's producing stuff that is, similar. And that can be really hard to do. And I've had actually surprisingly good luck using it almost as a search function for real photographers who we might want to go contract with. So that's been one sort of not direct generation, but the search function of finding image generating partners, I think, has been a real benefit, actually.
Okay, Mark.
Thank you, Dylan. I'm going to steal that. That's a great idea. I don't know. I don't have optics in what everyone's using across the organization, but I think it's, a lot of chat, GPT, Gemini, Claude. And I think it is, to Dylan's point, some internally facing mood board documents. We've seen some of that appear from vendors. Kind of got to keep an eye on that and a check on that so they don't kind of take on a life of their own, so to speak, beyond the AI presentation. But I think too, to Dylan's point, I think I've used it for, for a while for mapping itineraries for the most efficient route on a photo shoot. For example, you have a 10-hour day with a photographer and the crew. It's like, how do you get all your spots real efficiently within that time frame? And, still allow for, breaks and all that, drive time and everything. So I've used it there, a lot of planning, especially over distance, I think. And, you see people using it in the space to plan their itineraries. I've done that myself to, family vacation in Mexico City. How do we hit all the spots the kids want to go to and the places the parents want to go to in, 2 days, 3 days. So, I think the planning and, beyond the visuals, the planning and the tasks that took quite a bit of work and leg time before are, much more efficient now.
Excellent. Thank you. And what about at Brand USA? What kinds of tools are you using over there?
I will say I'm by far probably the most regular user of the AI image creation tools. And that's, my shtick for my presentations is that I'll take my headshot and have me do all kinds of random things. I have used just a little bit of ChatGPT for that. I agree the new image generation model is good. I find it's inconsistent for me. So sometimes it's amazing. And sometimes I'm like, why did I even bother coming over here? Because I don't even log into ChatGPT anymore. I'm so Claude coded, but Claude doesn't have the image generation. So I find in terms of just consistent delivery of an image, I am using Gemini. And I actually have the API hooked up to my Claude code so that when Claude is making a presentation for me, I have all of the images that it's created for me in my little jokey contexts, I have organized in a folder. Claude has renamed each of those files to describe what the image actually is of. And then there's an index markdown file so that if Claude needs an image, it looks at that markdown file to see if a good one already exists. And if it doesn't, it writes a prompt for Nano Banana and it uses the API to get the prompt, create the image and the right specs and drop it into the presentation. And so part of why I lean into that shtick too is like, I want it to be obvious that it's fake. I don't want somebody watching my presentation and wondering, oh, is that a real destination image or not? Yeah. Because that's our presentations. Typically a Brand USA presentation is going to be many images of destinations. We want those to be real.
Yeah, well, and that consistency, that's a really good point about the consistency, which is important. If you're doing that through an API, you need to sort of have an expectation that it's going to be consistent, which they aren't always, right? Non-determinism, that there is kind of weird stuff that happens in there. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about audience behavior. And I think you all have touched on this a little bit in kind of your own description of usage. Are you seeing signals or, how are you thinking about how the audience is using tools to plan, and where does AI generated content fit into that picture, whether it's visual or otherwise? Like, is there a component of this where your audience is is somehow editing or generating? Like, are they, do we think they're editing their vacation videos this way? We'll go back, we'll start with you, Janette, so we'll just sort of go back and forth this way.
Interesting, just because that's never occurred to me to do that. I will say, while I am on this call, I'm like trying to finish up a website for my husband's 50th birthday. We are going to Vegas for kind of like a family trip, leaving on Friday. And I was like, oh shoot, I forgot to make a website for that. And so it's like all kinds, it's funny. So it can have fake images in it because it's a funny website. And you could probably hear me in the other room. Like, I'm going to go have AI create images of him with the cat doing funny things to put into this website. So surprise, Jeff. I could see use cases like that. I mean, I think there's realistic ways of editing video. Like, I use Descript as an video editing tool all the time. I think Descript is so useful. Even for things like, this webinar, you can go in, remove all the ums and ahs. You could overlay, whether it's, real imagery, or if you wanted to make a graphic to illustrate a point that you were making, throw that into the video, add music. How that would play out into somebody's like personal vacation planning journey. I mean, I could see content creators doing that, right? I'd be curious from that perspective, as opposed to from the consumer perspective, how people are using those tools.
Yep, maybe Dylan, when we get to him, has a take on that. Mark, how are you thinking about audience use of AI?
I think I thought about the question mainly in planning, and I touched on a little bit before, but as far as videos, I'm sure that people are using it quite a bit. We don't really see that as we kind of curate the user-generated content we interact with and post and everything. So our team does a really good job of that and making sure it's authentic, and we'll get to that later. But as far as planning, we don't really use AI to approach planning in that visual way, other than the small, production items we kind of talked about in the past. There might be some AI tools we use for, closed captioning and some of those other productions things. I think we'll get to those a little bit later, adding alt text to images, things like that. But that's more of our side of the shop and not necessarily the consumer side. So don't have a lot of optics into the consumer use of it. I think, trip planning, we talked about a little bit before, and using of the images and Janette's example of Vegas, I could see people doing that, making, a family making pitches for what they want to see when they go to a certain destination, and having the pre-slideshow of what they want to do and kind of battling it out that way and selling it to each other. So when they get there, they can maybe go to the points and the museums they want to go to.
Excellent. And Dylan, thinking about the audience, what sort of thoughts do you have about audience kind of usage? How are you thinking about people experiencing those things?
Mostly what I've seen, to be honest, is somewhat of a turn towards negative sentiment. I think, you probably saw all the booing at various commencement speeches when people even mentioned the words AI. There's a strong, that's what I'm seeing on the consumer side. It's really an issue of trust. It is about a question of trust and other more sort of existential stuff. I think internally or professionally, I think I'm seeing a lot more usage across the board. So you can include, things like generating PowerPoint presentations using AI. That's imagery, but it's not necessarily pictorial. It's more design or website stuff, and that stuff kind of is mostly fine. Like you can be better or worse at it and take more or less time to make it good. But I think that stuff's okay. But I think sort of consumer wise, there's pushback. And then even workplace wise, I hear from other folks, and I think from the word output side, I think there's also some growing frustration. When someone sends you a document that's 50 pages long and is a straight output of Claude, you're like, hey, this is not respectful of my time, nor did you do the work to pull out the actual pieces of information. So I do think it's kind of, it's changing. It's both being used more and sometimes in ways that are totally fine and really don't cause any alarm. And then there's these other uses, both, especially in kind of text generation, where I think there's some frustration happening as they actually come into really common workplace usage. But not seeing consumers actually produce a ton of AI imagery. It's kind of a weird hobbyist subset who's doing a lot of that stuff. I don't see it. And maybe joke imagery, Janette, actually, to your point, is the one place where you kind of see it. People do something goofy, they send it to a friend. Otherwise, I don't see a ton of imagery production from consumers.
You know what we are?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, that what we are really getting into at Brand USA, like to double click on that, Dylan. It's less the image generation for Brand USA, but how it's helping the design team is it makes amazing, like not just PowerPoints, but like PDF files. So documents like an itinerary for a fam trip. That's actually, and that is something that our design team will create a PDF for that, because just doing a Word document doesn't quite feel like enough. But PDF sucks for that use case because the people on the trip, they're looking at it on their phone. And what really works well for that is like create an HTML file, because then you can update it in real time and it, matches the screen size. And so like that's a great way to use AI. A PDF file of here are the people attending the fam trip, or like a handout for I lost all my use of words today. I've been talking all day. I'm sorry. A handout if you're doing a sales mission. There we go. The sales mission, who is attending the sales mission, that could be a PDF that AI creates for you. And it's really good at, if you say what the designs, that you're looking for, if you have a design language or examples of what you want the output to be, you give that to Claude and say, this is what I want you to build in the future, and so create a skill so that when I say I'm doing another sales mission, what questions to ask me so that you end up with, great, here's your PDF file. And then our designers don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah, I think those are great examples. I think everyone has highlighted the kind of the theme there is there's a lot of different uses of AI in the organization that is starting to sort of permeate all of the different tasks that we do. And I think this makes a really kind of like a gray area about which things are okay and which things aren't. And so I want to move on and talk a little bit about like policies that you all are thinking about or putting into place? Like, how do we draw lines around those kinds of usage? In some of these cases, you've talked about using, maybe like Descript, where there's a lot of stuff that is happening in Descript that is AI kind of enabled on the back end, but it isn't materially changing, like it isn't regenerating that video. And then there's other cases where we're taking something that is kind of the reverse of that feels like it's an image that we're editing, but then turns out to be completely regenerated. So we'll go back to Dylan and kind of start with like, how for Odyssey, like you guys do a lot of image stuff. Like, how are you thinking about the policies or drawing lines around these things are okay and these things aren't? And then does that include a requirement to disclose, and at what level?
Yeah. I will say the reality is we're bumping into this stuff in real time and then figuring it out. Like, I won't name any names, but a vendor did try, I won't say they were trying to pass it off, but they were basically presented AI generated creator videos to a client. And I sort of had to say, wait a second, I don't think they realize these aren't like mock-ups. They're not like, this is the thing you intend to put out on a social platform. There was never a person, they never went to a place. Like, I think that's going to be a problem. And the level of disclosure and buy-in you need to do this is very high. And so I think mostly what's happening is we're bumping into these things, and you're just sort of like certain internal docs, like what Mark was talking about. They're just showing up and it's fine. Honestly, it's like, great, and to Janette's point, if you actually take the time to give it some skills and say, do it this way, not your default, you're already much ahead of the gen. So I'd like to see even more of that, as kind of like, don't default to the generic storyboard output. Like, let's choose some stuff we want to do and say, this is what I want you to reference. This is how I'd like you to work in the future. But I can't say that there's like a codified version of this yet. Especially because like whole new, like the world model stuff is so interesting. And I'm actually like so excited about that. I'm like, every destination, make your own like Grand Theft Auto version of your place, like without all the crime. But like, that's kind of amazing. Like, the idea to be able to like wander through and really get a sense of the place is like, that's not a thing that exists. It could exist. I don't think it's a matter of trust, because it's a net new experience effectively so I think there are places where you can do a lot that's really exciting. Ironically, pure image generation may be the like thorniest, most kind of problematic of all of these use cases. Yeah.
Interesting. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit? I think you've hinted at this. You want to talk a little bit about the kind of the way that you're thinking about policy and drawing lines around which things are kind of okay and which things need disclosure and which things aren't okay?
Yeah, we're a public organization, so we have a framework and guidelines from the state about, don't obviously upload any personal or proprietary information, all that kind of stuff. And then as an org, we kind of, fine-tuned it, use it as we talked about internally, presentations. Don't use it beyond like our examples earlier, just for public-facing or consumer-facing content. Don't use it. And we haven't really had a policy to disclose that yet, because we haven't really breached that yet. I think, to Dylan, your point about the Grand Theft Auto, I was thinking the same thing earlier on in this discussion of like, do you let kids, experience visually, do you make basically a video game for the kids to play with and drive around your state, or, drive through the waterfall without hurting anything, obviously, and, all kinds of things like that. I think would be great. But again, that would be a special use and something that's, bracketed or constricted to, this is, AI fabrication for that use, and gamify it. I think there's a bunch of fun applications that we, be continually developing. And we have also seen it with, some visual content in, partner creative or different uses. I alluded to it earlier of, agency creative, where, it's just not necessarily pitched as real or end product, but kind of a mood board that might have gone a little too far or out of control or something. But yeah, I think as long as we know that now early on, I think as it gets more, the tools get more sophisticated, we talked about it, we won't necessarily be able to discern that quite as easily. We're already seeing that. So I think that, having a policy not only for our organizations, but, our vendors and procurement of, disclose to us, all AI uses, at least visually, or anything that would be, potentially approaching consumer facing content.
Excellent. And Janette, I know you do a lot of work on policy, both at the Brand USA and kind of at the sort of trickle down level. You're a proponent of policy. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you're thinking about imagery and visuals as part of that policy?
For me, it's just the disclosure piece. Like if disclosure is part of your policy, then it doesn't matter if you're talking about video or text or anything else, because it's about transparency with what you're doing. And like, nobody wants to feel tricked. Nobody wants to, see a beautiful ad for the Willy Wonka experience, and then you show up and it's, one girl with like orange makeup on her face. No, nobody wants to be fooled, or to, even when your mom tells you about the video that she just saw, and you're like, oh, Mom, that's AI created. And then she feels stupid, right? Nobody likes that feeling. So disclosure saves you from being in that spot. It hasn't really applied to us, because beyond like me doing presentations with the silly pictures, we're not using AI generated images in that way. So but it's like, even internally, if we were doing something for a mock-up, you'd want to, and I think, Dylan, this goes back to, like, I know what vendor you were talking about with that example. It's like, you have to be very clear every step of the way. If this is meant to be a proof of concept, you have to say, this is AI created and it is a proof of concept. This is not the final piece. And as long as you can do that, then I think you have opportunities, like Mark, when you were talking about, the video games. I think of how much easier projection mapping must be to do right now. What kind of opportunity is that? That's something I'd wanted to do when I was still with New York City around America 250. Could we create some kind of interactive historical walking tour experience that would incorporate projection mapping, in Lower Manhattan? So I think there's way, and I know projection mapping is very expensive, but if it's a little easier to do now through the benefit of AI, you already know projection mapping's fake. So there's not you didn't do authentic projection mapping. Like, if you're going to have characters from Hamilton walking through an experience, it's already fake. So like, embrace the fake piece of it and just be obvious that it's fake. And then you can be as creative as you want to be.
That's a perfect sort of transition here. So if we shift from there to kind of talking about authenticity. So we talked a lot about the way that AI is kind of what it's capable of from a visual perspective, how it's being used, what kind of the edges of that are. Let's talk a little bit about the other side of that. Does the existence of the tools and the use of those tools put more pressure on being authentic? And as it becomes sort of more common, how are you making sure your destination's content is prioritized, right? That it stands out. Like, what is working for each of you in like spotlighting or discussing real people, real voices, local perspectives, things like that. So we'll start with Janette then and work back again.
Yeah, I think the American Originals series that we've been working on with Miles is a good example of that, right? Like, leaning into people who are real and having real experiences and telling a real story. I know research says, like, it's the people that draw somebody into a destination. And that's what helps to separate one destination from another destination. So, like, really embracing the quirks, just like people say, oh, when you write now, you actually want to leave in a typo or two because that shows that a human wrote it. Like, for all of the ways that I use AI, it's not for writing, because I don't want to read AI generated writing. If I'm writing something on LinkedIn, I want it to be weird, because weird is what stops the scroll. Weird and quirky is what makes you, oh, wait, what was that? And like, that is what the authentic has the opportunity to do if everything is a little too glossy. And that's also, I think, the funny use cases of AI, because they do say, oh my goodness, I didn't know you could do that. That's a good use case. If it's just to make another, blue sky backdrop of a city skyline, like, who cares? Like, you have to dig deeper to find what makes your destination unique than that, I think now.
Very good. Mark, what about you? How are you thinking about or leaning into authenticity? That's always been a big thing for Travel Oregon.
Yeah, I think we align with what Janette said. I think we've always really focused on our content teams focusing on telling the real stories of real Oregonians through place and kind of cultivating relationships with genuine voices and lived experience, and especially as relation to place. We've focused, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, our social team is focused on generating or cultivating high quality UGC images, constantly looking to recruit real families, real couples, real Oregonians, and for photography, photo shoots, going to the real places, obviously, and looking for new storytellers and Oregonians doing interesting, unique things. Going back to Janette's quirky comment, I think we've kind of embraced that as a brand, not over the top, nothing irreverent or anything, but there's kind of telling those fun, unique stories statewide. And I think, just staying true to our North Star of being, authentic in all the content, visual, text, translation, having that human eye on everything.
Excellent. And Dylan, you and I have talked about this a couple of different times. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting about travel as a sector, as it relates to AI, is that travel is inherently a personal experience. And the reason that you travel is to feel something, right? Like to feel a certain way. And the only way you could really get that is getting it from a real person. So an AI can sound like it's been to a place. It can apparently even make a picture that looks like it's been to a place. But it fundamentally cannot have gone to that place or had that experience. And so it shifts the focus, I think, to people, right? How do we communicate the personal experience becomes a really fundamental part of that. So Howard, like Odyssey is about storytelling, right? Your kind of history is about storytelling of quirky things too. Like how do we embrace but also demonstrate the authenticity of the content we're creating?
Yeah, I think authenticity can be found in many different ways, and it's not just about sort of like profile pieces, which I love, and we make many of. But like, Mark, I brought this up the last time we talked about the CA, which is the only slightly exaggerated campaign that Oregon ran a number of years ago, which was animation, right? Like it was sort of Miyazaki style animation. It had whales flying. Like it, in fact, was full of sort of not real things that still managed to capture something deeply charming, authentic, dreamlike about the place it was describing. You could do an entire campaign in oil painting if you wanted to be a nut. Like, it's not so much the medium. It doesn't have to all become profile pieces or, creator-led experiences. That said, I do think that is a place where people can connect because there's a trust built in, especially if it's with someone that you have you follow, you have some relationship, you sort of trust their take on stuff. I think that becomes more valuable. I think we are in a kind of like worldwide trust crisis Like I find myself reading stuff with this like twitchy paranoia where in some third paragraph, I'm it's an M dash. I'm like, that's fine. Like M dashes are useful, like probably do. And then you're like, oh, but there's that like triplicate it's repeat. And I'm like, wait a second, you know, and I've become this kind of crazed nut. Like I kind of feel like this is true. I think it's worse in the text world actually. But it's true to some degree in the imagery world too. You scroll through a feed and you stop and you go like, I don't know. I don't know. And in a way you're like, well, I guess I don't care. But in some funny way, it flattens everything else. So I think stuff that cuts through that, like to your point, Janette, stuff that is weird and sounds distinctly from a person's point of view. I'm going to recommend an amazing piece of writing by a Substacker called Sam Chris. And the title, warning, the title of the piece is, "If you use AI to do your writing, I will come to your house and kill you." And and the reason he wrote that is he was like, here's one thing AIs can't write for you: death threats. And he's like, here's the kind of, we've entered this crazy place where we have one writer writing everything for us. They're writing the back of a cracker box, and they're writing a yogurt advertisement, and they're writing somebody's constitution of their business. And that's weird. One writer is that's not going to work even if it was the greatest human writer in the world. It would sound insane. If Stephen King wrote every piece of copy in the world, we'd all lose our mind. We'd be like, what is this? So I think it's true in imagery.
I would read a Stephen King cracker box. I think that would be really interesting.
This is maybe an
not
AI
saying
task actually to go and, try. And I think we are in a trust crisis. And I honestly find the weirder, more unhinged stuff breaking through for me, because it's just not got this smooth quality. It feels human. It feels strange. It has the viewpoint. We're all like a little bit mad, and that's kind of like the charm of us. And I feel like, I think this like fever is breaking, and we're figuring out like, oh, this is a tool usage, really valuable. Great. No issue. And then this is something where it's sort of not net additive. It actually kind of starts to be net negative. And so we're in this funny place of like evening both out. I don't know. I rambled there. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but that's yeah.
No, I think that was good. All right, we're going to do kind of one more panel question, and then we're going to move on to the audience questions. And we have some good questions already, but if you have a question that you want the panel to answer, now is the time to put it in the QA. And then we'll do our best to kind of combine and curate those so that we have a few minutes to the end to answer those. So the last kind of official panel question here is about practices. So we want to try to provide some indicators for the participants today. What is one practice that you have adopted in your organization, or that you are in the process of adopting, that you think DMOs or travel brands should be thinking about right now? So some practice inside the organization that you think is portable to the audience. And we'll start with Dylan and then work backwards.
I'll return to what I was talking about earlier, which is to say, AI as a search tool can be very, very valuable, even though it's a kind of basic use of it. So I think the idea of sort of using AI to find great local image makers, local photographers, and say, we don't have a huge budget, but maybe I can contract these people for, $2,500 a pop, whatever it is. Like, I think in some ways, like, use the tool actually to connect with the broad set of creative people in your location and figure out a way to bring them to the table. Like, I think that is a sort of an AI use that ultimately grounds you in making a lot of interesting, beautiful imagery by human beings, because there's just a big world out there and there's like a lot of creative people in it. And so that's a practice that we've been using, and I think is exciting.
Excellent. Mark, what's a practice for Travel Oregon that you've adopted that you think DMOs and travel brands should be doing?
I'm going to adopt Dylan's practice that he just shared again, saying that I really like that. I'm going to use that in my work starting this spring. I think as far as AI, I think, using it to streamline workflows. A lot of our partners have smaller, staff counts and smaller budgets and everything. So being efficient there, I think is a big win. I think as far as I can go analog a little bit here. I think, showing up with intention and not in the IAI space, but just in your content creation, your storytelling, and that emotion that we talked about, and connection with people, being, very intentional about building deeper relationships in your community, and the wide breadth of voices that exist in your community. So reaching out to people that maybe aren't represented daily in the space, and kind of cultivating those relationships, and realizing that our audience is getting more sophisticated, wanting that more personal relation, and our audience is also varied and diverse. So I think in the analog world, moving away from the AI discussion to imagery for a minute, I'd say cultivating those relationships across the board.
Very good. And Janette, what is a practice that Brand USA has adopted that you think is relevant for DMOs and other travel brands?
I'd say visible AI use, particularly amongst leadership. So Gallup did a poll last year where they found like the number one predictor of your staff adopting AI is if that staff member's direct supervisor is using AI. And if in those instances where the supervisor is visibly using AI and talking about it, 79% of their staff will use AI themselves. And that number is only 34% if you don't see your boss using AI. So
Wow.
making people comfortable saying that, which, ties back into the visibility piece. Like, say what you are doing, it allows other people to jump in and say, oh, actually, you should not do that. That is a terrible way to use AI. Oh, you're using generative fill. You should know that is like artificial. It's fake. It's not the real photo. You can't do that when you aren't openly talking about it and removing the shame around the idea of using AI, removing this idea that it must be cheating. I was listening to a podcast, might have been the Marketing AI Institute podcast yesterday, where they said some of the jobs that are going to be changing, like, in this world where, the graduates are booing largely because they're scared about, are they going to find jobs in this new world? The jobs that are most affected are measurement jobs. And that's not always the most interesting part of the work, right? Like I used to call it being the data hobo, that I have to go and log into 12 different platforms and hunt down 3 different, owners of verticals to find out, all right, for restaurant week, how did it do? Well, you have to go over here to social. You have to go over here for this other platform. And okay, how many media impressions did it get? How many, and it takes forever to collect all of that stuff and then normalize it and then make sense of it. That's instantaneous now, or it should be. And so when you remove all of the hobo going around and finding all of the pieces, and you get to move forward with what all of those pieces tell you to do, that's when you get to do what Mark is talking about with creating relationships with your community. There's no gold star for figuring out all of those measurements. Like the gold star is then what do you do
that's
with
a good
it?
point.
How does the business change? And in a world where DMOs, like, we don't have all of the funding that we want, and we don't have all of the staff members that we want. And we never will, because we dream bigger than we have the opportunity to deliver on. So this tool allows us to do more good for our communities with the dollars that we're given. And I think we have an obligation to see that through.
I think that's a really good point. Also, I'm imagining a Stephen King story about a data hobo. Now I feel like there's really something there. Excellent. All right, let's answer a couple of audience questions here, and we'll start with one from my neighborhood. So the question from Bjorn Spritzer at Tourism New Zealand says he's keen to hear from the panelists if you have seen examples where AI imagery has beaten out a real image, And so that doesn't have to be from your organization, just could be something that you saw or were paying attention to. And I will open that up to any of you to answer that question if you have seen any of those examples of kind of a head-to-head.
Beaten out is, it's like, I don't know, made me laugh harder. Like, certainly you can make an AI image that is going to be more beautiful than the original image, but then that takes us back to that authenticity question, right? Like, at what point, remember when Photoshop was new and there was a lot of hand wringing around making the sky more blue for your brochure photo, and is this okay, is it not okay? We may enter that time with AI generated images where it's okay, you know, we don't have to use Photoshop to make the sky blue. Now it's AI making the sky blue. Are we okay or not okay with that? And it's not like a law, you know, set in stone. We'll shift over time with what our expectations are and what makes people feel like they were tricked or not.
I think there's a, yeah, sorry, did somebody else, did I interrupt somebody? I think the answer for Bjorn is is we're not really aware of any of those happening kind of head to head in that way. We definitely have talked about that internally at Miles, is like, how do we do a side by side comparison to try to see if we, you know, can we make something that improves the response on a campaign. I know that there have been some of those. The ones that I have seen, there was one that won an award in Australia last year, maybe, could have been older than that. But it was AI optimization of the campaigns, not AI optimization of the images. And so there's kind of different levels of that, where the AI was looking at the performance, which is sort of what you were talking about there earlier, Janette, is the like, we're interested in what does this mean for us? How do we do something differently more than we are in just collecting those numbers? But I think there's a real valid question here. Like, if we take a bunch of images and we go, these are real images and these are generated images, can we see, do people detect that, right? Like, do they know that? How do those images work? And can we actually create something that maybe performs better, even if it's not something ethically that we necessarily want to do? And I would say that's probably the biggest problem, is that ethical question, particularly when we're in the travel business. Is no one's really willing to do that kind of double blind on images to try to test that out.
I did think of an example-ish.
Okay,
of
great.
what he was asking about. Did you see this online? Somebody posted, maybe on Reddit, you know, here's a AI generated image of a Monet painting. Pick it apart for me. And the internet just went nuts with how horrible this image was. And they're like, yeah, joke's on you. It's a real image of a Monet.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's I remember that one. That's a really good example. I think a lot of that is this is very reactionary, and we've heard that a couple of different times from the panelists, is that the sort of audience has this sort of reactionary response to AI, and that will change over time. And that's part of what we kind of have to plan for as an industry, is thinking about, like, where is that now and what does that look like in the future? Okay, another audience question says, as AI makes misinformation easier to generate, fake websites, fake content, how do destinations and travel brands protect their authority and keep travelers trusting their content over that false info? So have any of you thought about that, like, kind of the playing field that you now exist in, and are you making different decisions about what you do in order to defend that?
I mean, CA, this is something that we've talked about, sort of specifically thinking through website and whether destinations can kind of create something a lot deeper than a website that is almost like what you'd call an MCP, like something that is meant to be read by machines, and is kind of where you store an enormous amount of data structured in a way that's like clearly readable by models. And maybe you generate websites out of that, or you generate apps out of that material, but it almost is like, you know, it is the source of truth even one step back from where that's been historically, which is like the website. it's almost, it's behind that. It's text, it's highly structured. It's more about information hierarchy. And then that becomes very valuable for sort of keeping a source of truth for the models. And then other products might flow out of that. So I do think we'll see that as an increasing, I mean, Janette, I'm sure I'm curious what you think about that, Janette, but that feels like coming maybe.
Yeah. I want to be the one that makes it come here. I call it destination as a service. And it's the idea that you're not just going to say,
Yeah.
hey, Chat GPT, what should I do? It should be, hey, Chat GPT, plug into the Brand USA MCP server, which has downstream from it, the information held by New York City Tourism and the state of Oregon and every single DMO across the United States, so that if you want a source of truth, both about events happening in a destination, but also about like verified storytelling, that there is a place that you name check in order to connect to get that. So that is my dream for how this would work in the future.
Excellent. All right, Mark, that leaves you with the last word. Do you have any final words of wisdom on kind of defending your authenticity in the marketplace?
I don't know. I think wish Mo was on this call. He's probably thought of all this already. But I think just being that source and staying true and telling the stories and putting out that content. Maybe it's not a purposeful archive like you're talking about, but to draw with it. But if there's enough content there and you just keep the cadence of creating that authentic content, you'll never be able to keep up with AI models and various potentially nefarious sources, so to speak, but and misinformation. But I think just staying true to the information you put out and putting out a good cadence of that as a ballast for truth and authenticity and staying true and keep maintaining that relationship, I guess, through volume in some ways with your consumers of not that they have to read it all, but that it can be repurposed in models for their consumption.
Very good. All right. Thank you to all of you for participating and all of you for joining. And we will see you on our next roundtable. So thank you all. Have a good day.